Good evening and welcome to HemiScope. I'm Peter Smith, Director of Latin American Studies here at the University of California, San Diego. Tonight we take a look at Mexico's new president, Vicente Fox, and his ambitious agenda for overhauling Mexico's government. Our panel will discuss the incoming administration and the challenges Fox faces after this background report. Swept into office by Mexico's thirst for change, Vicente Fox became president on December 1st. He is the first opposition candidate to win the presidency in more than 70 years. In fact, some would say more than 100 years. A plain-talking former Coca-Cola executive, Fox is known as a charismatic man with big ideas. At home, Fox has pledged to fight corruption, improve education, and help the poor and the indigenous communities. And in a pre-inaugural trip to Los Angeles, he outlined plans to boost relations with the United States by expanding NAFTA and combating drugs.
We will strengthen the trade ties that emerge from NAFTA. We will address the issue of Mexican migration to the United States from the ground up, and we will lead a frontal, the mother of all battles against drug trafficking.
As Fox steps into office, his ability to govern will be tested by a fractured Congress where no single party holds a majority. It has been said that the challenge Fox faces is to steer Mexico's transition from a perfect dictatorship to a difficult democracy. My guests tonight are Wayne Cornelius, Director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies here at UCSD, and Elliot Blair Smith, Latin American correspondent for USA Today, who is based in Mexico City. Welcome, Wayne. And Elliot? Elliot, let me start with you. What was the atmosphere like at the inauguration on December 1st? It sounds absolutely euphoric.
Inauguration Day ended with a ticker tape parade down before the Zocalo, the center's historic square, with more than 100,000 people. It started with a blessing just after dawn, mass that Fox took, and then he went to a breakfast with homeless children on the street, and in the trail that follows his own career path from homeless on the street to the Chamber of Deputies, where he was sworn in as president.
And there was a mild earthquake and volcanoes were belching. It sounds as though the gods were expressing their approval of this magnificent event as well.
Or concern, because the opposition party was jeering in the aisles as well. But as he did throughout the campaign, he really stood tall and strong, and with former President Zedillo at his side, in the Chamber of Deputies, he gave a withering attack on the 71 years of pre-rule, and it was one of two major addresses during the day. Later, he gave his inauguration, which was a very uplifting address.
And the reaction of the pre-legislators, we'll come back to that later, but I understand there was jeering and catcalling.
It was like a meeting in Parliament in London where everyone has their feet up on the table and gives the Bronx cheer.
And how did President Zedillo react to all of that?
Zedillo, remember, divorced his own administration from his party, so is not loved by his own party. He was just implacid. He gave no reaction throughout.
And was the celebration for Fox individually as a political leader, or for the whole idea of his program, or could one tell a difference?
I think from Election Day forward, there's been just great joy, alegridad, that was reflected throughout the campaign. Wherever he went, there was a spontaneous joy. With the ruling party candidate, even among his supporters, it seemed to be a sense of obligation.
Wayne, one of the first clues to the incoming Fox administration came from his selection of cabinet officials. What would be your characterization of the cabinet as you look at it now?
Extremely heterogeneous. The positive construction is that he was extremely inclusive, plural in his selection of people according to their previous political party affiliations, ideology, a lot more people with business management backgrounds as opposed to government technocrats. It is a very strong economic team, which has inspired great confidence already in U.S. markets.
Does that suggest that it will continue the same kind of policy that we've seen in Mexico over the last 6 or even 12 years?
In terms of fiscal discipline, yes, he's appointed as his Treasury Secretary a dyed-in-the-wool monetarist who believes very strongly in fiscal discipline, keeping deficits down, but he's also a hawk, a very strong advocate of tax reform, bringing up Mexico's abysmal tax effort, which is now about 11% of GDP. That's the equivalent in government tax revenues, which is even below Brazil, which is not known for its fiscal discipline and efficiency. So there are competing agendas here. The foreign affairs team is even more heterogeneous.
Right, that is led by Jorge Castañeda, whom we know as an academic and who has been here at UCSD.
Yes, but he's also appointed a national security coordinator, Adolfo Aguilar, who is supposed to be coordinating all of the foreign affairs and national security related parts of the apparatus. He has appointed coordinators above the level of cabinet ministers on the organization chart for social policy and economic policy. And it's difficult to see how all of this is going to work. There are clearly overlapping lines of authority, and there are people with competing agendas within the administration. So just getting his own administration to pull in the same direction is often going to be a tug of war.
Elliot, many were expecting here in the United States that he might appoint one or two holdovers from the Cedillo cabinet, Jose Angel Gurria, the outgoing Minister of the Treasury, or Luis Tellez, who has been very effective as energy minister. Was it a surprise that he did not do that?
And another name was Herminio Blanco in trade. He failed, and it reflects a larger failure in his cabinet, which has not been acknowledged. He failed in any of his major objectives, one of which was to bring in opposition leadership. Another was to give women a large representation. There are only 3 women in a cabinet, sub-cabinet leadership of about 3 dozen. No major leader of the opposition. The resumes of his cabinet members, with the exception of the Secretary of Treasury, these are people with their own Horatio Alger stories, and they can distinguish themselves on their job, but they have not distinguished themselves in their past.
One of the concerns some people have is that the expectations are too high, that partly because of his personality and partly because of the way he won that stunning election and partly because of the things he said since and partly because of the promises that he's made, that he's simply setting himself up for disappointment, that he has promised, for example, to try to keep economic growth at 7% per year, which is very high, to produce more than 1 million jobs a year, to extend education to everybody, to reduce poverty by 30%. That seems like really too broad a menu. Some have said that he didn't have to do that. Is that a fair criticism, and do you think he's shooting too high?
Fox is a juggernaut. He won, triumphed by raising expectations. It was the only manner in which he could win. Now he's trying to dampen expectations, and he's doing it as quickly as he can. He's reduced his GDP estimates to 4.5% from 7%. He's now saying, well, I only have 13% of the federal budget that's discretionary. He's really backing off. He's only going to have so much time that he can back away before he has to push forward again, and that's when he has to turn symbols to substance.
Well, Wayne, this brings up the question whether he's going to be able to accomplish these goals or any major goals. Give us an idea about his dealings with Congress, for example.
Well, the first point to make is that Vicente Fox is a politician, a businessman turned politician who is very accustomed to operating within a divided government. He spent 5 years as governor of the state of Guanajuato. In none of those 5 years did his party, the PAN, have a majority in the state legislature. Nevertheless, he was able to get most of his key pieces of legislation through and to build a track record as a successful governor, which he subsequently ran on as a presidential candidate. I think we're likely to see a two-pronged strategy for getting things done, especially in the Congress. One is to play the populist card, to be the most successful populist president that Mexico has had since the 1930s under President Lázaro Cárdenas. He is going to be a man of the people. He has already said that he will be in the streets constantly. He will travel incessantly. He will deal visibly symbolically with the problems of the poor. He will bring the Indians in from their marginalized state. He will make peace with the Zapatistas. He will crack down on corrupt police who prey on the poor, etc. He will live in the guest quarters behind the presidential offices instead of in the opulent presidential suites. Now, some of these are purely symbolic measures, some more substantive, but he clearly is going to try to build an overwhelming base of popular support, while at the same time he has appointed some very skilled political operatives in the Interior Ministry who are going to be cutting deals with key members of Congress and key state governors so that he will be able to bring along a substantial chunk of the political class at the same time that he's building up his popular support base.
Elliot, you mentioned the uncertainty, though, of his relationship with the political opposition. He was unable to get members of the Party of the Democratic Revolution, the opposition on the left, to take cabinet posts. There are no direct holdovers from the outgoing PRI, and the PRI legislators during his address jeered and catcalled him. He has even uneasy relationships with his own party, the PAN, the Party of National Action, because he's really not a party person. Within Congress, how do you see that this is going to play out? Wayne has suggested he might go around Congress. Within Congress, what do you see?
Can Fox succeed? With an electoral base of just 42.5% of the vote, he has a limited mandate to govern, and yet, as of Saturday, his pollsters showed a popularity rating of 80%, and so that shows that he has some room to maneuver. He wants to do in Congress not just pass legislation, but change the Constitution. He is short of a simple majority for simple legislation. He's far short of the two-thirds majority for constitutional reform. But ultimately, he's a dynamic figure. There's no one equally agile or forceful in Mexico politics today. He confronts no unified opposition anywhere.
And where's he going to get?
Yes. One other thing. In dealing with the Congress, he does have some things that he can offer. For example, making it possible for members of Congress to be reelected. This is something that could be used to curry favor among many members of Congress. It takes a constitutional change to do it, so I think that there are some chips on the table that might actually be very effective in building support in the Congress.
What about the practical question of money? Where is he going to get the money to accomplish these big reforms? As you said, Wayne, he sounds like a populist, not what one might have expected from a conservative candidate. Truly a compassionate conservative, to use a U.S. term. But is he going to have the money for this? How is he going to raise the funding, the public funding, to be able to carry out some of these very ambitious social programs?
Well, this is, in fact, a major challenge. Now, none of the initiatives that he's announced so far are really big-ticket social programs in the mold of previous Mexican administrations. He also appears to be eager to tap the resources of the Mexican migrant community living in the United States, at least for small-scale development projects.
Elliot, let me ask you this. It's been said that in order to accomplish these goals, Fox is going to have to wield the kind of imperial presidency that he is dedicated to abolishing. That is the all-powerful, omnipresent president of Mexico. Is there a contradiction somewhere?
He absolutely rejects the image of the imperial president. And I don't think that he will be the imperial president, but he's such a dynamic figure that the sheer force of his example will push that country forward.
I'm sure we will feel the consequences of the force of that personality. Thank you, gentlemen. Next up, what a Fox government means for the U.S. border and for U.S.-Mexican relations. In this segment of HemiScope, we look at how Vicente Fox might handle border issues and Mexico's relationship with the United States. Joining us now is Norma Iglesias, a professor of communications at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in nearby Baja California. She is currently a visiting professor at San Diego State University. Welcome, Norma, to our group. And Wayne, let me turn back to you for one point to continue the previous conversation about Fox's economic policy and implications for the United States. He's a committed free trader. He apparently wants to promote even more foreign investment. What can we expect in that area?
Well, he has said that he wants the United States to play an even greater role in the development of Mexico than the two preceding administrations. So I think he is going to try to create some new attractive investment opportunities, particularly in the energy sector. But his real challenge is to keep Mexico's export boom, exporting to the United States, going at its present level.
And that depends, at least in part, on the state of the U.S. economy.
That's correct. And it also depends, and this is his second priority on that front, it depends on bringing more small and medium-sized businesses in Mexico into the export sector. The vast majority of them don't export anything now, and he has made that a top priority.
Well, that was one of the concerns about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that in fact small and medium business might get squeezed out in Mexico, and that would ultimately exacerbate problems of inequality and economic development.
Yes, he sees that lack of participation by the small and medium-sized business sector as being too much of a drag on the entire Mexican economy and as an obstacle to achieving greater social inequality. So that's why he wants to attack that problem.
Norma, all these questions have implications for the border region and for the northern part of Mexico. What can we expect from a Fox administration? What has he said about the border region, and what kind of goals has he established?
I think there are two important things, that the formation of two commissions that are related with border issue. First is the border issue office that is with Ernesto Rufo Apple, the ex-governor of Baja California, and the other commission that it's important and is completely related with the border and U.S. relation is the Office for Immigration Affairs that is directed by Juan Hernandez. So that two offices seems to show that the Fox is really interested in border issues, and he knows very well that part of the development of the country is related with the Mexicans who are living outside the country, particularly in the U.S.
What can we expect from Ernesto Rufo, as you said, a former governor of Baja California, the first panista governor of that state, by now a practiced politician? What can a border czar, as he's been called, accomplish?
It's not very clear what is the border office is going to work on, but it seems like it's going to be out of narco traffic. That is something really complicated, and it's not clear that if he's going to take charge of immigration issues. But basically seems like he's going to be in charge of U.S.-Mexican relation, infrastructure, development, and that kind of things.
Elliot, let me just ask you, who is he going to talk with on the U.S. side? Is he going to talk with state governors, with mayors, with people in Washington? There's no counterpart.
I asked Fox this question, and he expressed irritation that it wasn't obviously clear, and it wasn't clear to me. But Rufo is really going to be the ambassador of goodwill to foreign investment, and those are the people that he's going to be speaking with.
Now, I'm going to come back to you. You mentioned the question of immigration. What would be a policy stance? That is, my understanding has been that Mexico's position has been that citizens have a right to leave the country if they choose. That is the right of a free, open, and democratic society. Is this office going to try to curtail undocumented migration to the United States or protect the rights of migrants who do cross the border?
I think they are going to be in charge of those Mexicans who are already in the U.S. Yesterday, they have a meeting with some Mexicans, American, and leaders of immigration organization, and they have three really important commitments. First is to check all the customs office, recognizing that there's a lot of abuse for the migrants in the border crossing. The second is to take charge of all the money that is going back to the country, and Fox says that the federal government is going to give $1 for each dollar that the Mexicans are going to invest. Mexicans who are out of the country are going to invest in their communities of origin. That it's something to help with this idea of the create changarros of a small business in their own communities.
So these are kind of matching grants for remittances from the United States?
Yes. And the third is to make easier that process of sending money back. That is really complicated. There is a lot of profits for many offices in that. So he's really interested in use that money and use all the effort of those Mexicans who are already out of the country.
Wayne, that's very creative, but it sounds to me like this creates an incentive for people to migrate, documented or not. That is, in some ways, this appears to support or provide some kind of incentive for people to migrate to the United States, and when they send money back, then the federal government matches it, so it's a good thing.
Well, let me just point out to respond. These are the easy elements of the immigration issue for the Fox administration to deal with, because they really depend upon actions by the Mexican government. And increasing economic opportunities in key sending areas is something that Fox is personally committed to as the ex-governor of one of the traditionally most important sending states. I don't think it's going to create that many additional incentives to migrate to the United States. Where he's going to have greatest problems are in increasing access to the U.S. labor market for Mexicans who have not already migrated, along the lines of the proposal that he floated last summer for free labor movement among NAFTA partners, and doing something to reduce the death toll at the border being caused by the current policy of U.S. border enforcement. And anything that he proposes in those two areas is likely to encounter fierce resistance, political resistance on the U.S. side.
Well, Norma, you know both sides of the border very well. Would you agree that much of what is accomplished on the Mexican side of the border depends on what happens on the U.S. side of the border, and that in some ways these promises are contingent upon cooperation or collaboration from the United States?
Yes, I'm sure that the Mexico is completely related. The globalization is very obvious on the border, so we really need to work together. And I think Fox is know that we have to understand quite well the Americans, the American economy, everything to understand, because we are interdependent. There's a strong interdependency in both countries. But it seems to me like it's interesting that it's a symbolic issue that he create two new offices that are related with the border. And this is something new and give us a lot of expectation and hope for the people at the border.
Elliot, in addition to foreign policy questions regarding the United States, there is the issue of Fox's foreign policy in general and relations with the rest of Latin America and Europe and Asia. What do you foresee with the appointment of Jorge Castañeda as foreign minister and some of Fox's aspirations to redefine or enhance Mexico's position in the hemisphere and indeed around the world?
In Mexico City, Castañeda is referred to as the ambassador to London and Paris, representing his interests and his politics. But Fox himself will drive foreign policy. In the 5-month transition, he traveled to 3 continents, dozens of countries. At his inauguration, there were 18 foreign heads of state. That's 3 times as many heads of state as attended the Carlos Salinas inauguration 12 years ago. He has a very global view. He sees Mexico as a citizen of the world, and he believes in bridges, not borders.
You mentioned in one of your pieces his plan, the so-called Puebla to Panama plan for strengthened diplomacy in Central America. What does that entail?
Primarily, the whole southern region of Mexico has been a developmental backwater, and as reflected in the Chiapas conflict, Central America has many of the same problems. He is really seeking to take some of the excessive development in the north, some labor-intensive, low-tech, low-capital industries, move them to the south, develop the region, balance out the country, and he'd like to share some of that development with Central America.
And does he aspire to become a leader of Latin America as a whole, in some ways to redefine the continent's relationship with the United States?
Well, ever since Simon Bolivar went on horseback from country to country throughout South America trying to unify the post-Spanish colonial countries, there's been this dream, the Bolivar dream, and it's now reflected very forcefully by Fox. How realistic it is, it's probably a faint hope. South America, and particularly Brazil, are worlds removed from Mexico.
But still, the dream lives on, and it's an interesting aspiration that Mexico would become, in some ways, once again, the leader of Latin America in its relation with the United States. But let me ask you this, Norma. There's a little bit of nationalism occasionally in some of these currents. Is it possible that in the course of his sexenio, Vicente Fox might feel either tempted or obliged to distance himself from the United States and to assert independence and autonomy for Mexico in relationship to this colossus of the North?
I don't think so. He's a businessman profile. He knows very well that the globalization is something that you can stop. So I think he's going to create a new formula in terms to develop the nationalism without questioning that their future is the globalization. There's no other way to do that. And I don't think so. He's going to work on reinforcing this feeling of nationalism that is part of our identity, that is something that is politically strong. And I think one of the good points of Fox is that he recreates this sense of nationalism. He's with these popular ideas of being close with the people. So
in this sense, during the inauguration, did you sense a new feeling about Mexico and its culture and self-identity? Was that part of the atmosphere?
One of the most moving moments of the address is he said, we're not going to talk about whether the cup is half full or half empty. The fact of the matter is, for millions and millions of Mexicans, the cup is practically empty.
On that moving note, we have to close this conversation. Thank you, Norma. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Elliot. And that wraps it up for this edition of HemiScope. See you next year for a new edition of HemiScope. I'm Peter Smith. Thank you, and good night.